It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Environment Minister and Rishi Sunak supporter Victoria Prentice, Shadow Prisons Minister Ellie Reeves, The Guardian's Raphael Behr, and GB News presenter and former Northern Ireland First Minister Arlene Foster. Today,
Rishi, you have raised taxes to the highest level in 70 years.
I'd love to stand here and say, look, I'll cut this tax, that tax and another tax, and it will all be OK. But you know what? It won't.
Tory leadership contenders clash on tax and question each other's character.
All attempts to paint me as an out-of-touch individual will fail. I'm the only person on this stage that has won and fought a Labour seat.
This is a short history of Rishi Sunak and Brexit.
He campaigned to leave the EU. So why is the former Chancellor having to convince people he really is a Brexiteer? And it's not just the campaign that's hotting up.
The Met Office have issued a red extreme heat warning across much of central and southeastern England.
Hello. Well, let's start with that story, the fact that it is hot. Take a look at this, the front page of The Sun newspaper. This is their take, hotter than the Sahara. And you can see there the picture of people flooding the beaches over the weekend. But also have a look at this. This is the front page of The Guardian with a slightly different take on this. Red alert, ferocious heatwave set to send temperatures beyond 40 degrees C. And the picture there is actually an image of one of the firefighters in France, because, of course, there have been wildfires that have broken out over Europe. Now, we know that some schools are closing early. We know that some employers are advising people to work from home. There is disruption and cancellation on the trains. So my question to the panel is, are we overreacting or are these sensible precautions? Ellie?
I don't think we're overreacting. The heat that we're likely to see over the next couple of days is unprecedented. And frankly, it's alarming to hear some of the candidates in the Tory leadership election saying that they're not sure whether we should meet our net zero targets in 2050. I would have thought that the weather of the next few days should be a wake-up call that we've got to do everything we can to meet those targets.
We will come back to that, but just on this original thought, overreaction or sensible precautions. Arlene?
Well, obviously, it's important people take sensible precautions, but I'm not sure the government needs to get involved in telling us what to do and what not to do. I would have thought people should have had the common sense, to stay inside, to hydrate, to make sure that their pets are safe. I just think it's a bit of government overreach, actually, and we need to be very careful of that, given that this all started with COVID regulations. And I think people now have got into the situation where they expect the government to tell them how to live their lives, which I think is absolutely wrong.
Victoria, is it government overreach?
No, I don't think so. I think these are really very high temperatures and we are concerned about people's health and older people in particular. We've seen in previous heat waves in Paris in particular, where there were a large number of excess deaths. It's really important that people, particularly those that don't get out or about, are able to keep themselves as cool as possible, keep themselves hydrated. Elderly people sometimes are reluctant to drink water, but they really must. And we also need to be careful of our young people. I left a whole gaggle of young people at my home this morning celebrating a birthday. I did say don't jump in the river or be very careful if you do. We need to be careful about people acting unusually because they're too hot.
OK, Raphael.
Yeah, I'd question the comparison with COVID regulations. The police aren't walking around telling people to sort of get in the shade. And there is a difference between sort of 35, 37, 40 degrees and 20 degrees. This is a country where people will get their shorts and take their tops off, when it just about reaches double digits in the temperature. So I think it's probably wise to say, look, this is a different order of temperature event. When there's a flood, you warn people, this is extreme weather. It's different. It's not just a sort of standard hot spell. OK, I want to come back to something that, Ellie, you mentioned at the beginning, and this is net zero. Take a look at this story in the Observer from yesterday. Now, this says climate chief Alex Sharma, who, of course, was the president of that COP26 conference that took place
I may quit if new PM dumps net zero pledge. So he's suggesting, well, he's urging the leadership contenders to hold to that pledge to reach net zero by 2050. Also take a look at this. This is a story from today in The Times, which says net zero slumps to bottom of Tory members' priority list, suggesting it's something that Conservative Party members don't care as much about as other issues. Victoria, do you think this is slipping down the agenda of the leadership contenders?
It's certainly very high up my agenda, coming from DEFRA, and I know it's very high up Rishi Sunak's agenda.
Although he did talk about this can't go too far too fast.
He's very committed to the net zero targets. When we were new MPs, I noticed that he joined the EFRA, the Environment Select Committee. I know that this is something they discuss as a family a great deal, as many of us do with our children, frankly. And I suspect that whatever that poll shows about Tory members, when they come to discuss the two candidates that are going to be presented to them carefully with their wider family, for example, then we may find climate change, particularly after a spell of unprecedentedly hot weather, creeping back up that agenda.
You think they'll change their tune?
Well, I think it's really important. I know that Conservative members are very interested in nature, in farming, which I'm the Minister for, and it's very much connected. We have to work hand in hand with nature if we're going to have a productive farming world going forwards. And I think Tory members know that. Many of them live in rural areas and see this very, very in their faces every day.
Raphael, do you think this has been front and centre of the campaign enough, the Tory leadership campaigns?
Well, I think there's a concern that because it happened to be something that Boris Johnson, there was for a period, I mean, he made lots of things his flagship policy at various different times, but at one point he was very keen on making net zero an emblematic part of his legacy, and therefore in the haste to kind of repudiate all of Johnsonism, this sort of gets left behind. But I think Victoria made a very important point there, which is actually the people, anyone who's actually around the land working in farming, that is a Conservative constituency who just sees that nature has shifted, that the seasons are moving, the wildlife is behaving differently. I think we're well past the point where climate and climate change were considered to be something that young people or the liberal left were interested in. I think it has become much more mainstream. And although in this specific Conservative contest, there are going to be other issues, Brexit, tax are always going to be up at the top of people's concerns in that particular electorate. For the wider country, climate is definitely way up higher than it was even 5 or 6 years ago.
Arlene, do you agree with that?
Climate is very important, but of course, as a former energy minister, there are three things that you always had to take into consideration. One was security of supply, one was the cost of the energy, and one was the mix of the energy. In other words, moving towards renewable sources to try and deal with carbon. And I think we've forgotten about the first two, regrettably. And security and cost are two huge issues, and I think they are concerning people greatly because, of course, we're in a cost of living crisis at this moment in time. And therefore, that's why you're seeing people say, well, hold on a second, we do want to deal with carbon in our energy supply. We do want to deal with the hydrocarbons. We want to move to more renewable sources of energy, such as hydrogen, such as wind. But at the same time, we also want to deal with security of supply, which, of course, has been exposed due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the cost of energy, which is crippling a lot of people. When I look at energy bills, you can see how they're crippling people in their everyday lives.
OK, Ellie, just a thought on the cost of this. It comes with a cost, doesn't it?
I think that we can't afford to ignore what's happening with the environment. One of the things that I'm disappointed about is that in this leadership contest, we're not talking more about the move to renewable energy. So, for example, there's been very little said about wind. Labour would double onshore wind capacity, increase offshore, triple solar, and all of this is missing from this debate. And the next Prime Minister is going to have to make very difficult decisions, and I would like to see much more said about the environment and how the leadership contenders will meet their obligations and commitments.
I'm going straight from here into the environment hustings, which is just for MPs, it's not a public thing. But I absolutely know that all of the leadership contenders will be engaging with these issues.
Well, maybe you can tell us after what they say, Victoria. But something else that is coming up in this leadership contest is, of course, the question of the economy. We know that is a clear dividing line between some of the candidates, particularly when it comes to their tax plans. Let's have a little listen to a clip from last night's leadership debate. This is Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak.
Rishi, you have raised taxes. to the highest level in 70 years. That is not going to drive economic growth. The fact is that raising taxes at this moment will choke off economic growth and it will prevent us getting the revenue we need to pay off the debt.
Rishi Sunak, respond to Liz Truss.
I mean, we have to also recognise that we just went through a once-in-a-century pandemic with all the damage that it did to our economy, and I think everyone realises that we were going to have to pay that back. But I'd love to stand here. I'd love to stand here and say, look, I'll cut this tax, that tax, and another tax, and it will all be OK. But you know what? It won't. There's a cost to these things, the cost of higher inflation, higher mortgage rates, eroded savings. And you know what? This something-for-nothing economics isn't conservative, it's socialism.
Well, I'm glad to say we are joined now by Ben Chew, Newsnight's economics editor. Thanks for being with us, Ben. I guess the question is, can we afford a tax cut?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the consensus among most mainstream economists is that now is not probably a terrific time for tax cuts because of the inflationary pressures, which adding more demand to the economy through cutting taxes would deliver. I think it would depend, though, on which taxes were cut. Perhaps fuel duty would be less inflationary than others, such as income tax. And it's a question of really, what is your tax strategy over the long term? Are you trying to cut taxes to alleviate the cost of living crisis this year? Are you trying to cut taxes to spur growth over the medium and long term? What spending might you pair that tax cut with in order to keep the fiscal books balanced? So these big questions are the ones that you need to ask. And we're not really getting that, it's fair to say, a complete programme for any of the candidates who are proposing tax cuts at the moment. And that's, I would say, the concern of most mainstream economists.
Right, you touched on one of the points there that Liz Truss has made during the course of this contest so far, the thing she referenced to Rishi Sunak suggesting that higher taxes stifle growth. Is she right?
Well, I think if you look at where the UK is at the moment in terms of the league table of other countries and their overall tax burdens, we are above some. We're above the places like the US, we're above Switzerland, but we are below others. We're below Germany, France, and places like that in terms of the amount of tax they take as a share of national income. And there's no direct correlation between the level of the tax burden and growth rates we've seen over recent decades. So the idea that tax cuts alone are the thing that is stopping or that would deliver better growth for the UK, or that has delivered our relatively poor performance, isn't really stacked up. There's lots of other things going on. As I say, most mainstream economists would not argue that simply cutting taxes is the route to prosperity for the UK.
Ben Chew there. Ben, thank you very much for joining us. Victoria, you are a Rishi Sunak supporter. I just want to put to you a line that we got from Downing Street. Our political editor, Chris Mason, was briefed this earlier about the former Chancellor's economic plans. The source said, what a shame he didn't offer them to Boris Johnson when he was begging for them over the last 5 months. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't know what to make of that. Rishi, to my view at least, was an superb Chancellor and worked very closely with the Prime Minister during the pandemic to come up with some really practical and innovative ideas to support the economy and indeed to support people through an unprecedented time in their lives. So furlough being one example, bounce back loans being another. These obviously came at a cost, and Rishi's been quite honest about that. I mean, anybody realises that if the government has to wrap its arms round business and employees in that way, of course we have to pay for it. And Rishi has made quite clear, both as Chancellor and now, that his priority at the moment is to try to keep inflation from spiralling out of control. And I think that's the right priority. And I don't see any difference from Rishi as Chancellor and Rishi as leadership contender in that regard.
A lot of your colleagues don't agree. A lot of your colleagues have been pushing for tax cuts for some time and they don't believe that Rishi Sunak's going to deliver them, the point that Liz Truss effectively was making.
Rishi is definitely a sound Conservative believer. I've known him ever since we were both first elected. It's clear to me that, like all Conservatives, we believe that people spend their money best for themselves. But we also believe that we have to help those in society who need help. And clearly, during the pandemic, Rishi acted in the way he did, which I think has been proven to be really effective, and he had to raise tax funds to do that. I think most people watching this programme will understand completely that we have to pay for the years of pandemic.
OK, Arlene, who do you think is right here when it comes to tax cuts?
Well, I think to go back to Ben's point, you can't just talk about tax as a whole. You have to look at specific taxes, and certainly in terms of corporation tax, if I can take that particular piece, we believed when I was in the Northern Ireland Executive that we needed to lower our corporation tax in Northern Ireland because the Republic of Ireland was at 12.5%, and therefore they had an advantage over us in terms of foreign direct investment. And to do that, we would then enable growth to take place in Northern Ireland. So the fact that Rishi Sunak is talking about increasing the corporation tax in the UK as a whole is actually worrying, because I think that will stifle growth, and therefore he should look very carefully at that again. And I'm taking that corporation tax as the point that Liz Truss was making about if you raise taxes during a recession, then you will stifle growth. And I think the particular one is corporation tax. So I think that needs to be rethought through.
Raphael?
Yeah, my understanding particularly on the corporation tax thing, though, was that it was actually cut. George Osborne cut it, thinking that it would have exactly the effect that Arlene's talking about. And actually, it simply didn't. Now, you might have wanted it to, but the evidence from the Office for Budget Responsibility from the Treasury just showed it didn't work. So, that's why they're changing that. And I have to agree essentially again with Victoria that no one looks at Rishi Sunak and thinks this is someone who's actually a kind of a crypto social democrat who's just itching to raise taxes. Obviously, he's a Tory. Obviously, he's actually quite a Thatcherite Tory. Now, there's a separate question here, which is actually, what is the underlying cause of inflation, and is this something that's just going to work its way through the system, and are people overreacting to inflation? And the danger is that you will sort of suffocate growth and then trigger a recession, which could make things worse. That's an interesting economic debate. That's not the debate that's being had by the Conservative Party. The debate that's being had on the Conservative Party is basically whether you are willing to say the sort of magic shibboleth word tax cuts to indicate that you have a sort of purity of belief in the creed of conservatism or not. And ultimately, this is a problem that's been around in British politics for a long time. The UK would like to have continental European-style public services with American-style taxes. It doesn't work. And, ultimately, you're going to need a Prime Minister who, at some stage, can tell people that. And at the moment, this contest isn't producing that argument.
Ellie, your leader's been quite critical, Sir Keir Starmer, about the way the Conservative leadership contenders have set out their tax plans. But the truth is, we don't know what Labour's tax agenda would be at all, do we?
Well, the candidates, I think, have put forward something like £3 billion worth of unfunded spending commitments in their various policies that they've put forward. But we've been clear that under Labour, we would tax fairly and spend wisely. That's why we've put forward plans to end non-dom status, for example, tax break for the rich, ending the loopholes on private schools and on private equity. And you look at the national insurance increase that the government has pursued. That targets working people, but doesn't affect those that earn their income from rental income or from stocks and shares at all.
But we don't know if Labour would reverse that, or indeed what corporation tax or income tax
We'll
would
need
be.
to look and see where we are as we approach the next general election and the situation that we inherit. But that underlying principle of taxing fairly and spending wisely is what underpins what our policies will be.
OK, I want to look at something else that came up in the leadership debate last night, and this is the question of transgender rights. There has been quite a lot of discussion during the course of this debate about whose position was what in government when. Listen to this exchange from last night's debate. This is between Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch.
When I took on the role of Equalities Minister, we had to change the existing government policy, which previous ministers had put in place. And what I'm challenging, or what I challenged Penny on, is what that policy was. She is saying she did not agree with it, but I don't understand how that would be the case. If she had been the previous minister, if she didn't agree with it, why was the policy as it was?
Talk to Kemi Badenoch. Well, look, I wasn't the previous minister. The stuff in the papers today demonstrates what my policy was. But what I would say to you is that all attempts to paint me as an out-of-touch individual will fail. I'm the only person on this stage
Penny, I'm just telling
that
the
has
truth.
won and fought a Labour seat.
I'm telling the truth.
My constituents do not elect people who are out of touch.
So that was the exchange on last night's debate, and you heard Penny Mordaunt there referring to stuff in the papers. Just take a little look at one of the headlines. This is from the Sunday Times from yesterday. It says, leaked documents call Penny Mordaunt's gender self-ID claims into question. Well, I'm pleased to say that we are joined now by George Freeman, who is indeed a supporter of Penny Mordaunt in this leadership contest. Thanks for joining us, George. Can we just try and get to the bottom of this here? What was Penny Mordaunt's position when she was in government? Did she believe that you had to have an official diagnosis of gender dysphoria to process on and change your gender?
Yes, 2 points. Firstly, thank you for having me on, because this has been weaponised in the most horrific way in this campaign. And I think it's really, really unfair and inappropriate. I'll deal with both points. Politically, Penny Mordaunt has campaigned all her life for women's rights. She's the most outspoken of all of these, far beyond Kemi and Liz. She's got a long history on it. And she believes very seriously that compassionate conservatism should mean defending the rights of the mainstream, but also being compassionate to those in minorities that don't conform to norms. So it is very important that those who are really struggling with the trauma of their gender dysphoria, that we're compassionate to them, that we're sympathetic to them. But at the other end, it is completely wrong, and we cannot have men dressed up as women or men in women's changing rooms or people with male bodies competing in women's sports. Holding those two views should not disqualify you as some sort of woke warrior. And David Davis and I wouldn't be on this campaign if that was the case.
I just want to come back to this point about, because really this has been about, and it hasn't really been resolved yet, because you heard Kemi Badenoch there say that she inherited a policy of self-identification, suggesting that came from Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah, 2 points.
So
I mean, she was not the predecessor minister. So firstly, just to rebuff
did Penny Mordaunt support a policy of self-identification when she was in government?
She supports the policy, which, by the way, was the whole government policy, which Liz Truss and the whole cabinet was signed up to. This was a consultation setting out and asking views, and Penny's view was and remains that those people who are suffering with the trauma of dealing with this dysphoria need to be taken seriously, but ultimately the law should say that you're only a man or a woman when you've been through the medical and surgical process.
And that includes a formal medical recognition of gender dysphoria. That was Penny Mordaunt's position.
What she's trying to signal is that we should not be hostile to people who are going through this wretched, traumatic issue, and that we should be sympathetic to them. But legally, we should never have a man in a woman's changing room or men competing with women. Very clear, and I'm afraid it's been weaponised by people who, you know, Kemi should know better. She's weaponising this to stir up a sort of dog whistle campaign against Penny Mordaunt. The reason she's winning amongst women, head and shoulders, the reason she's got 3 times more women supporters than Liz Truss, is that Penny has campaigned on women's rights all her life.
OK, Arlene, I just want to get a sense of what you are making of all this. Who do you trust on this? And do you think, as George said, it's being weaponised as an issue?
Well, undoubtedly, it's been weaponised as an issue, but we're in a leadership contest, and if people think that it's tough in a leadership contest, wait till you're the Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, because this will continue. And I think when people are putting out videos and clips, it's important that we see the entire context of videos and we see the entire context of what is being said. I have seen the videos that Penny is speaking about in the House of Commons. She gets up and she says trans men are men, trans women are women, and that's the case before the Gender Recognition Act consultation, and it will remain the case after the Gender Recognition Act. And therefore, there is this doubt that she supports trans men to be men and trans women to be women without any more conversation about what that actually means. And I think people are concerned about that. I think the campaign, and you've heard George there say what it is that he understands it to mean, but it will continue because this is a leadership contest and people want to make points of difference, and they will continue to do that.
Briefly, George, then I want to bring in the rest of the panel.
Ali makes a really good point that if anyone is really interested in this, rather than just using it to weaponise, they should read the debate in Hansard, listen to Penny Mordaunt's comments and understand the framework of the consultation. I agree. But it is simply not the case that Penny is doing and was doing and is doing anything other than stating that in law, if you've been through the process of a sex change, you are in law a man or a woman. The point she's making is women should not have to fear somebody coming into women's changing rooms because they self-identify as a man, or entering women's sports because they self-identify as a man. But if somebody self-identifies, we should have a proper process to take them through the medical process with compassion.
OK, Victoria, this is one aspect of this campaign where it has been quite personal, really. It's been questioning people's word about what they've done in government. How do you feel as a Conservative when you see how this is playing out?
Well, I think we are, as a party, a very broad church. We always have been, and that's one of our strengths. And one of the reasons that we do spend many years when the public vote for us to be in power, truthfully. I'm always quite pleased, for example, with the tax debate, that we are able to have serious and grown-up conversations.
It's pretty fiery, isn't it?
It's fiery, but
Rishi Sunak calls Liz Truss a socialist.
I almost don't mind that. I think these are 5 crackingly good candidates. I would be proud to serve with all of them in government in the future and very much hope that they will all be there, part of the Conservative team. I think their diversity is in itself something of note and something I'm really proud of as a Conservative. With the trans debate in particular, I think language does matter. I think it does matter that we really are, and both appear to be, sensitive to people's needs and people's feelings. I think we need to continue to talk to the younger generation a lot, who have a slightly different perspective on this debate from mine, possibly. And I do think it's... I very much regret if we upset people in the language that we choose to use.
Well said. Ellie, Labour's had its own struggle with this particular issue as well, hasn't it?
Look, I think that it is a sensitive topic, and one that when we have these conversations, we've got to do so with dignity and respect. I don't think that anyone undertakes decisions around how they want to identify lightly. It's incredibly traumatic and difficult. So actually, sometimes when we, as politicians, have these conversations and debates, we need to dial it down a bit and think about the individuals involved and what they are going through and what their families are going through.
Raphael, this Conservative leadership campaign, it's gone pretty nasty, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, in this particular instance, I have to agree with what was said before, to the extent that it does look particularly like Kemi Badenoch has chosen the sort of anti-woke positioning for herself to get some distinguishing characteristic in this campaign in a way that isn't particularly helpful when you're actually discussing very sensitive matters. I mean, ultimately, you know, you've got candidates who want to differentiate themselves and, you know, there's going to be some conflict there. I think there is a broader issue in terms of the doubt as to what extent you're repudiating the whole legacy of Boris Johnson, everything that's gone before, while also wanting to inherit his mandate, because you're not going to have a general election. This next Prime Minister is going to have it's a peculiar mandate. It's kind of constitutionally proper because we're a parliamentary system, but it's a bit odd how that's going to work, this person chosen by Conservative Party members. And as a result, it's a very strange contest where you've got a lot of heat and not very much light, and you're going to emerge with this person who actually has been chosen by maybe at most 95,000 people in the country. That's just kind of weird for a lot of people, I think.
George?
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely right. The reason I feel so strongly, and many of us do, about this trans issue is, in the end, Brexit's done. I mean, the debate is put to bed. The people voted.
Although it's still coming up in this contest. We'll talk about that in a minute.
The question I wanted to raise is, I think for a lot of people who didn't vote for Brexit, they saw Nigel Farage on the TV and they worried that this is going to be a moment where we're going to step back away from a lot of the progress we've made on women's rights, on gay rights, on all sorts of minority rights. And I think what Penny is trying to say, and this is why she's the candidate that the left and the Lib Dems most fear, she's an authentic Brexiteer and a social liberal. She believes deeply in freedom, in choice, and that Brexit can be a moment where this Parliament and this country can keep moving forward as a force for good in the world and a force for progress in our country, and that Brexit isn't some moment where we go backwards.
OK, quick thought on this, if I could get your thoughts on this, George Freeman. This is the front page of the Daily Mail today. Mordaunt flouted number 10 ban to meet boycotted group. This is to do with when Penny Mordaunt met the Muslim Council of Britain, which was against, at the time, the government policy. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, well, first thought is it's another Daily Mail front page attacking Penny, and, you know, the reason they're doing it is that she's a very, very serious candidate, and they don't want her out in the last two because they fear she might win. But the substantive point, look, Penny Mordaunt, like me, is an outreach Tory. Our book, Britain Beyond Brexit, 40 MPs, is all about how we have to make Brexit a moment where we connect with the next generation, with the young, with people who aren't necessarily Conservatives. And on the Muslim Council, meeting people to say, listen, I'm sympathetic to the central tenets of a moderate Britain where we can involve and participate and break down barriers with the Muslim community, but not like that. And I think Penny is somebody who is in her vein. She's an outreach Tory. And I think that's a story that's been spun to suggest that she backs the Muslim Council. Not at all. She's meeting them to try and broker a proper conversation. That's what proper Prime Ministers do. OK,
George, well, you did bring up Brexit, so it would be remiss of me not to talk about how Brexit has been a factor in this Conservative leadership contest, as have other, of course, aspects that have proved to be something of a dividing line. This was something else that came up in the debate last night, in that TV debate. Have a little look at this moment between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss.
Liz, in your past, you've been both a Liberal Democrat and a Remainer. I was just wondering which one you regretted most.
I am somebody who was not born into the Conservative Party. I went to school in Paisley and Leeds. I went to a comprehensive school. My parents were left-wing activists, and I've been on a political journey ever since.
Arlene Foster, who do you trust more on Brexit, Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss?
Well, I mean, when I listen to people saying, George said it again today, that Brexit has been done, it has not been done. And if you live in Northern Ireland, you know that more than anything. We still live under the single market rules. We have an internal border within the United Kingdom. Goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland are checked in a way that is totally disproportionate and causes costs to go up in Northern Ireland and our choice to be diminished. So Brexit isn't done. And therefore, I have been listening very carefully to what all of the leadership candidates have to say in relation to the protocol bill, which is currently before the House. Liz Truss is the only one that has said anything substantive about it. And that causes me concern that the others don't see it as a priority, dealing with the internal market of the United Kingdom and actually the Union in general. There's been very little about Scotland. There's been very little about Northern Ireland. And if you want to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, you have to pay attention to the rest of us as well, and not just England.
Does that mean you're backing Liz Truss in this contest, Arlene Foster?
What I'm saying to you is that she's the only one that has been very clear on this issue. I've been disappointed to hear Kemi Badenoch, who I would have a lot of time for, not actually raise the issue and to say that Brexit has been done. Brexit has not been done. And when you see the European Union allowing goods to go from Russia into Kaliningrad through the European Union without anything like the number of checks that we have internally in the United Kingdom, you know that this is a hugely political issue and not a practical issue, and therefore it has to be tackled in a political way.
George, Victoria, convince Arlene that your candidates can be trusted on Brexit.
Well, firstly, Arlene's right that Brexit, the mechanics are not done. I was making the point that the politics is done. We're not revisiting that, and Penny's made that very clear. But on the point that the points Arlene makes, and they're well made, firstly, a lot of this is to do with relationships, and I think David Frost and actually Liz Truss have led us into a bit of a cul-de-sac, and we need some fresh leadership around finding a solution. And on the policy details, Arlene is dead right. We need to make sure that the supply chain of goods from GB to Northern Ireland flows properly, and that businesses in Northern Ireland can thrive. And Penny has actually set out very powerfully in her unity pitch. She doesn't just mean unity in the Conservative Party or in the country, but across the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. We have to end this divisive internal civil war and start to think about Britain in the world as a strong union. And I totally support Arlene. If Northern Ireland feels they've been hung out to dry, that won't happen.
Are you convinced, Arlene?
Well, we'll have to see what happens in the protocol bill. Unfortunately, Penny didn't vote in the second reading of the protocol bill, so I'll be very interested to hear what she has to say in the coming days.
Victoria, your candidate, Rishi Sunak, has released this video of him really brandishing his Brexit credentials. Why has he had to do that if he is such a strong Brexiteer?
He always has been. Ever since I got to know Rishi, it was one of the issues we talked about most as new MPs. I was a passionate Remainer, and Rishi and I frequently discussed why he felt what he felt and why I felt what I felt. And as we warmed up to the referendum in 2016, it was clear that he was going against the sort sort of Downing Street of the Times line. It was quite brave as a young MP to stand out for his views on Brexit. He was always a very global Brexiteer. He really believed that this was an outward-looking global Britain, that not a little Britain sort of Brexiteer at all. And he really believed that this would be better on the world stage for everybody if we could take this move. I've clearly come on my journey, a bit like Liz. I now am a firm Brexiteer in terms of agricultural policy, not least. And Rishi, I'm catching up, if you like.
Arlene, do you think that Rishi Sunak is a convincing Brexiteer?
Well, it's important that we speak about the United Kingdom, not just Britain. When we're talking about our nation, you know, we here in Northern Ireland need to be respected as British citizens as well as the rest of the UK. And to deal with that, we have to get the internal market of the UK back on a firm footing. At the moment, it's not there. We have these disproportionate checks and goods coming from GB into Northern Ireland. And as I say, raising prices, reducing costs, no one else in the United Kingdom would accept it.
Raphael.
Yeah, can I just say something about that Northern Ireland Protocol bill? Because this is quite important. You essentially have, for this government now, two options. One of it is to just stick essentially with the deal that Boris Johnson did. The other one is to repudiate it completely, rupture an international treaty, which is what the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill proposes to do, go into a long, protracted negotiation that goes back to arguments that we've been having since 2016, at the end of which, having set fire to all your relationships with Paris, Berlin, every other European capital, you'll end up with a deal that looks almost exactly like the one you've got now, or maybe a little bit more like the one Theresa May did, except you'll also have had a massive economic cost at the end of it. So those are your two options. And this idea that somehow the UK can, on its own, just say, no, we'd prefer this fantasy deal that the European Union doesn't want to do and doesn't recognise the terms of what we're doing, and we'll just dictate it to them. You've tried that since 2016. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. Those are the facts of Brexit, which we've established now for 6 years.
Arlene.
And
we need to move on.
Well, that's just nonsense, of course. And if you look at the protocol itself, in Article 13.8, it talks about any subsequent agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union will replace what's here in this protocol now. So that allows for negotiation. But of course, we've been negotiating with the European Union for 18 months now, and they haven't moved. They see it as the law of the Medes and Persians, that it's unalterable, despite the fact that the protocol itself says that you can alter it if there is a need to, if there's trade diversion, which there is, and if it's causing social problems in Northern Ireland, which it is. We don't even have the institutions of the Belfast Agreement up and running because of the way in which the European Union has decided to implement the protocol. So, I mean, we do have to deal with the reality on the ground here in Northern Ireland, and I think the protocol bill goes some way to doing that. Unfortunately, the European Union have turned their face to finding solutions for Northern Ireland, and therefore the United Kingdom government, which is sovereign in Northern Ireland, has to take action.
George.
Look, I couldn't disagree with Raphael's portrayal of two options. The whole point about this, and this is Penny's position, is that we've got to find a way through that doesn't destabilise the Good Friday Agreement and doesn't undermine disproportionately the free flow of trade between the mainland GB and Northern Ireland. And there is a very specific way of doing this. Let me take, when you get into examples, things become clear, and Penny is across the detail on this. Let's take, for example, gene editing, a technology that Europe has really held back and stopped, and we, with Brexit freedoms, can now develop drought-resistant crops, disease-resistant crops. The EU will say, well, we don't want any crop contamination on the mainland of Ireland, right? Well, there isn't any science evidence for it. We may well have to end up, as a short term, saying, OK, we won't grow gene-edited crops in Northern Ireland, but we will allow potatoes made from gene-edited, crisps made from gene-edited potatoes to travel across and be sold there. There are solutions to specific problems. We need to get into specifics and not, as Raf has done, suggest that this is basically Brexit doesn't work and we should go back. These are detailed issues, and when we get across the details in the spirit of goodwill, we can solve them.
Ellie, where's Labour on this at this stage?
Well, we were promised an oven-ready Brexit deal by the Prime Minister, and it's pretty clear, even from the discussion today, that it really wasn't. You know, we're still debating the Northern Ireland Protocol, and actually there are some really serious issues that the Prime Minister should have got to grips with. One of the things that Labour's calling for is a veterinary agreement, which will help with the flow of goods. But we've got a Prime Minister that's been distracted. He's been distracted by Partygate, distracted by
Well, we'll soon have a new Prime Minister.
We will, but not until September. We've still got these outstanding issues. one of the things that I would like to see is a deal for touring musicians. We've got a situation where our creative industries are one of our biggest exports, but actually musicians can't very easily tour with all of their instruments and kits in the EU because the government hasn't got a proper deal on touring visas. So there's a lot that still needs to be sorted out, but it's a government that's distracted and isn't getting it done.
Raphael.
I confidently predict that Arlene will be disappointed by the next Prime Minister on this subject. Absolutely. Absolutely. You can work on the small things, but ultimately the broad overarching framework of this deal that has to work with the reality of what the European Union is will agree on terms ultimately that will disappoint the DUP.
Arlene, do you think that's the case?
Raphael, look, that may well be the case, but I have to make the case from Northern Ireland, even though I'm not obviously a political representative anymore. I do want to make the case that we here in Northern Ireland deserve the same sort of respect as other British citizens across the UK. And to do that, we need to deal with the internal market of the United Kingdom. The sovereign government of the UK is in charge of the internal market. Protocol makes that clear as well. The protocol is full of actually inaccuracies and sometimes contradictions. It was agreed in a hurry. Boris Johnson was told it was a monumental mistake, not least by me. He decided to do it. And now we're having to deal with the problems that are out of it. So I hope that all of the Conservative leadership candidates know that it has to be dealt with. Otherwise, we're not going to have devolution in Northern Ireland.
Well, we've been talking a lot about the things that came up in last night's debate, and we can show you now a snap poll that was done after that debate took place. Now, this isn't Conservative Party members, this is more broadly adults. And just take a look at this. Who performed best in the debate was the question. Rishi Sunak comes out on top, followed by Tom Tugendhat, then Penny Mordaunt, then Liz Truss, then Kemi Badenoch. Raphael, how much do you think these kind of polls are going to influence the way that MPs choose to vote in the coming rounds of this contest? Are they going to look at how these candidates seem to be going down more broadly?
If it tallies with what they're picking up in their seats, yeah, of course they will, because they don't want to lose their seats. So if they think the wider electorate particularly likes one candidate or another, I mean, the particular dynamics on the doorstep might be different, might not reflect that, but certainly that will be part of the picture, because they don't want to be out of a job at the next general election.
George, is there a risk that Penny gets leapfrogged, because it seems that her support's been slipping in the polls?
Well, she stormed through last week into a strong second place. We're in a big fight. I think Raf is right that what colleagues, I think, are interested in is, can this leader reunite and take the heat out of a pretty divisive politics at the moment, reconnect with both the Conservative Party and reunite, but also win the next general election. And that's why Penny, I think, has got such backbench support. She polls really well in target seats in the southwest and the north.
Do you worry that Suella Braverman's support might go, for example, to somebody else and squeeze Penny out?
Oh, well, how leadership contenders try and mobilise their supporters, of course. But I think the key thing is which candidate is polling best with the target swing voters around the country, and it's Penny Mordaunt.
Do you think that Rishi Sunak now might become a target when you look at that polling, Victoria, that people might want to try and make sure he's not in the final two?
Well, clearly the other candidates have, whether you call it a grudging respect or whether you call it viewing him as the one to beat, have a view of Rishi, which means that he is the front runner at the moment. I think that's for good reasons. I think it's because he's clearly the one with the energy and the determination and the attention to detail. As Arlene said, these matters are not simple. Government is not easy. And I think he's also shown by his track record in government that he is the man to win elections. He comes up with these innovative and practical policies which do appeal to the general public. And I think my colleagues are clearly noticing that.
Ellie, who do you either want to win or fear the most?
Anyone that's elected the next leader of the Conservative parties, we will take on. And, you know, one of the things that I think we need to see is a general election, because at the moment it's going to be a small number of Conservative Party members who are ultimately selecting who the next Prime Minister is going to be. Let's take it to the polls. Let's see who the public wants.
And all the candidates ruled that out last night. A quick thought, there was due to be another leadership debate taking place between candidates tomorrow night on Sky News, but that's been cancelled because the candidates didn't want to take part, we're told. Raphael, do you think it's because this is damaging the Conservative Party? Quick thought.
Yes, almost certainly. They just, clearly having the candidates accuse each other of stuff which gives clips for the Labour Party to use in the future campaign. They decided that was a terrible idea. I think it's a shame, but it doesn't surprise me. OK,
well, there may be more debates to come. But from us, for now, that is it. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two. For now, goodbye.